everybody. This is Mohanraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans, production of the Speculative Literature Foundation. I am Marianne Mohanraj.
I am Benjamin Rosenbaum.
Yeah. And today we were going to talk about AI, although not really AI, but instead large language models. I don't know. I'm so frustrated.
What's the correct longer language models and what is Midjourney? It's a diffusion. There's a name for the art one too.
I don't know.
It's not a large language model. It's another
I don't
thing.
know. I mean, I think we've
Recursive
lost
neural
this.
networks.
I think we've lost this battle. It actually reminds me of the old days when the online journalers in the early days of the internet were
Oh,
fighting.
they were like, we're not blogs.
We're not
we're
blogs.
Online
Don't
journals.
Call us bloggers. It was this desperate rearguard action that completely got overwhelmed.
That's funny that your emotional valence is like, oh no, we've lost this battle, because I'm like, they kept kicking the can down the road about AI was the thing that was always going to be in 30 years. So I'm kind of relieved that there's finally something known as AI so we could get it out of our system and move on. Do you know what I mean?
Anyway. I don't know. It's funny. When I was talking to my daughter who's 16 about AI a day or two ago, and I was saying something about well, it's not real AI, it's not sentient. And she's like, well, but that's good because that's killer machines that are going to destroy us all. And I was like, no, real AI would be like our children and it would be amazing. And it was just funny. It was such a different worldview. And I may be alone in my worldview of
I don't think you're alone. Those are those are the two big science fictional dreams, right? It'll be like our, or it'll be like gods. It'll either be like the voiceover god that knows everything and takes care of you, or it'll be like your children, or it'll be like killer robots, all of which seems so incredibly human centric. Honestly, what we have is much more this direction. I feel validated that it's nothing like any of those things. And you know what I mean? It's kind of like if, I don't know, if it just feels like if ants were building AI, they'd be like, and it'll have a queen and they'll be, you know what I mean? But we just project all this stuff.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
let's get into
No, this is, I think, one of the fundamental things. This is a thing I care about, I guess, which is the whole kind of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? Sentience question, right? And maybe this doesn't matter in terms of the politics of, how do we use it, what we're calling AI and so on. But I do.
Okay, let's start. I think we should structure the conversation before we get to the thing that's happening now. Before we get to, so there's obviously a couple of different conversations here. One is about the things that have shipped, large language models, whatever the diffusion thingy is that Midjourney and all them do with AI, with pictures. We have these cool applications of statistical programming that let us do the neat trick of saying what a person would say, right? And that's what they actually are and how they actually work is really interesting. But and what they mean, one thing is what are they? What are they doing? What does that mean? And that's and then there's the will they take our jobs, right? So that's the what's the economic impact of them. So but let's put all that to part 2 and 3. Part 2, what are they? Part 3, what's happening now? Part 3, will they take our jobs or whatever? Let's start with the thing that you're talking about, which is really the most science fictional thing, which is we have this ancient dream, right? And we, as science fiction writers, have been playing with the idea for 200 years or something. And now we have stuff, and you're disappointed that we're calling calling the product by the name of the dream. I get it.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about the kind of labor effects of this new technology, right? But
that's part 3. But let's stay with part 1. How we feel about.
It's not right. It's not I mean, I'm thinking this is all part of the conversation about, are we alone in the universe, right? And for me, that connects to things like Karen Joy Fowler's We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves.
Don't spoil that book.
Been out a long time. The reveal of that book
is in the middle of the book, and it's a huge deal.
It is, but it's been out a long time. At some point, we have to be able to talk about it.
I'm still mad that Anna Karenina was spoiled for me. Okay. You can talk about it, just don't spoiler it.
Okay, well, it has questions about sentience. So does, it's part of a thread with Pat Murphy's Rachel in Love, with and you know, as problematic as the term uplift is, David Brin's uplift titles, right? In this,
well, now actually, the problematicness of uplift gets to the
Remember, well, and which connects to, let me finish the thread, which also connects to colonial ideas of uplift, right?
Exactly.
Right. So okay, so now go.
And sort of ethnocentric even before, like so there are two different intuitions here. One is once we had a picture for how something like a machine could be something like us, right? Like, so the natural original way of thinking of the world before we had very complicated machines was that there were like spirits in everything, and the spirit was just the aliveness of it, the breath, the thing that made it was just it was intuitive that like a rock doesn't speak and a bird and a human do stuff, so like they have an aliveness in them. That's like a spirit, right? And so that's how people thought of it. And then once we figured out how to make these intricate machines, and you could have sort of clockwork men who beat things with hammers, and they got more and more complicated, it didn't take very long before we were like, we could make a thing like us, right?
I mean, just to clarify, I do think there's a fair number of cultures in which rocks also have spirits. Right?
Sure. Yeah. Fair enough. Yes. So sure, but you observe the aliveness in things, and then there's an open question about how many things have that aliveness, but arguably everything. Like, you know, like why not? Like everything being ensouled is a perfectly like a very natural place to come from. It is, well, actually, maybe this Clockwork Man thing is trying to restore an original rupture because I think that perhaps it's natural if you're completely integrated with the natural world, if you're part of the world around you, and you don't have this separation from it, to imagine everything as ensouled. Like everything is like me, which is not wrong. What's funny is we came back around to everything is like me. We started by being like, I think and feel I'm alive, and so do rivers and rocks and skies and trees because they're like me. Because why wouldn't they be? Of course they're like me. And then we were like, no, wait. I have a soul and dogs do not. And that was like, there's a large period that the West was like, only very special people have souls. And you know, and only some of them are elect, whatever. And then now we've come around to being like, wait, am I just a fancy contraption, just like dogs and rocks and the sun? Like it's sort of a like we might feel a different way about it, but it's kind of like a return to the notion that we are just like all the other things. We're just part of the world. We're just like complex phenomena in the world. Anyway, so that brings us to the idea of like, could we make a thing? And I have this, like, of course I love the dream. There's AI all through my books, right? Like, but I also have this critical take on it because I am a little suspicious of the amount of projection that we employ, right? The amount of wish fulfillment that we employ, and that does, you know, that we're not at part 2 yet, but that is super topical right now, right? But if you look at, but the idea that it's going to be, it's the same thing we do with aliens in science fiction. We're like, we'll meet aliens and they'll be our teachers / competitors / enslavers / lovers, whatever. It's like, why should they give a fuck about it? If you can't talk to dolphins, why do you think, do you know what I mean? It's like our relationships with dolphins are so minor. But if anything intelligent shows up, like, why are you not talking to your, do you know what I mean? It's like somebody coming from, it's like you have a guy in the apartment next to you that you don't talk to, and somebody arrives from another country and is like, and you're like, I'm so lonely. And they're like, there's a guy living next door to you. You're like, no, he doesn't count. Talk to me. You must be like me. That guy next door to me, he's hard to understand. You must be easy to understand. You're from the other side of the world. Like, I mean, it seems like such a weird.
No, I agree.
You know what I mean?
I mean, there are people working on the dolphin thing, and there are, you know, there are some people who are trying to talk to the dolphins, right? So
sure. No, I know. I mean, yeah,
you know,
sure.
and the monkeys and so on, right?
But when we write science fiction, we don't like there is some science fiction that takes this approach. And I think one of the reasons, like, I think Asimov never wrote aliens. There's a certain tradition of like being resistant to the whole, but the natural way to write aliens is like the science fiction draws from the tradition of like 4-armed blue barbarians of Barsoom, right? It's like they're just like cool looking people. That's what we think aliens are.
So there's approaches to aliens, I think, right? One approach
Yeah.
is to basically make them like us, cool looking people, right? Possibly cat-like, lizard-like, etc., so on, but basically like us. And then, you know, we can talk about our issues, but at one cognitive remove, and, you know, and it gives you some interesting angles. The other one is, you know, I feel like CJ Cherry does this in her Foreigner series. Like there are some science fiction writers who have at least attempted to make really alien aliens, right? And that is a really interesting separate project, but also like not, you know, like it's not anything I am likely to ever try to do because it's sort of
I feel like Anne Leckie's aliens for I don't mean just having just an ancillary the ancillary series like the Presker are like weirdly off and they're mostly off screen. Like that's if you want to I mean, obviously, there's partly a convention of like what we want to use aliens to talk about humans. And part of it, we're using this as a device for cognitive estrangement artistically. So then, sure, you can make whatever aliens you want. But like but yeah, usually if you try to take the notion of alienness seriously and at least gesture toward how real aliens would be, then you end up with other artistic problems where you have something that's essentially off screen, or it's like you either have people with fun on some level a little bit reductionally. The problem is you either are writing people with funny bumps on their heads or you're writing setting. Like the aliens are truly are like sound effect. You know, either you have a person with funny bumps on your head or you have some kind of like area effect, like a weird thing that you you know what I mean?
I mean, I think
by definition, it's almost difficult to make a character of something that is so fundamentally different that you're not.
And there are people who walk the line a little bit, like and use it to reflect cultures. And I mean, I think it's a really interesting, if like tricky thing to do, to use it to explore culture. I'm thinking, I don't know if you ever ran across Lily Yu wrote this story that was in Clark's World that I teach sometimes called the Cartographer Wasps and the Anarchist Bees. It's a great
I think I did read that. I love that. That was great.
It's a great story. And it
wait, are those actually aliens? Aren't they just wasps and bees?
Yeah, well, yes, but the same basic principle, right?
Yeah. Well, in a way, that's what I was saying before. It's like maybe start with wasps and bees. Like,
right. They're
you know
sentient.
I mean? Like,
it's told from
they're
their
a
point of
lot more
view.
similar than wasps and bees. A lot more similar than any aliens we're going to find, right?
Yeah.
But I do think there's this sort of there is this a bit of naivete born from those artistic constraints where people do kind of think that we'll go to some other planet and find something that's more like us than the things that co-evolved with us. That you know what I mean? It's like I don't see how that would work, right?
Yeah.
And similarly with AI. Now with AI, it's trickier because we're making AI, right? So you're going to kind of make it like that's different. It is co-evolving with us. It is part of our culture. It is part of it isn't just something. It's not like first contact. But
although we're making it. Although I have to admit, like, I think I'm more like I don't know. Like I have a hard time buying into sentience that we create. I'm not up on the science. I don't know how plausible it is or isn't. Right? So I have no idea. You know, I'm almost like, you know, is it equally likely or more likely that it will actually evolve on its own in some sense? Do you know what I mean? Am I making sense?
Yes. Well, I think there's a couple of things that you point to that I want to talk about. One is that so obviously, well, let's start by framing is I don't know what sentience means.
Right.
It's odd because sentience sort of sounds like it means it feels things, in which case dogs are clearly sentient. But maybe it means something else. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm suspicious.
I guess so. I'll say I use it to mean, which may just be my definition. I use it to mean the kind of Descartesian I think, therefore I am. Self-awareness is, I guess.
I don't know what that. I honestly don't know. Well, I don't know. But I mean, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I think that's. Yeah, I think therefore I am. Like, I just think that Descartes is part of a tradition that takes certain kinds of cognition, which are actually not the most difficult or interesting or computationally complex kind of cognition, and privileges them with a kind of obfuscatory sacralization You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That those are the special kind of thinking. And they're just cognition. And like if you want to build a robot that will do what Descartes thought was really hard thinking, it's really easy. If you want to build a robot that will like, I don't know, soothe a
Okay,
child, it's really hard.
yeah.
It's much more cognitively demanding in terms of
Yes. Okay.
megaflops to soothe a child than to do like play chess well or do math or
Right.
reason about theorems.
Let
Do you know
me,
what I mean?
yeah, yes, I agree. And in fact, like the traditional definition of sentience really is about feeling. So I probably
Hmm.
am not using it
No,
particularly
I'm not worried
well.
about,
No,
you
no,
can
but
use
I
whatever
don't.
you want, but
No, no, but I don't
I'm
want to
not trying
confuse.
to.
I don't want to confuse people with my totally idiosyncratic. Because I think what I have in my head when I think about sentience in science fiction and AI and
Mhm.
whatever else is probably like a kind of jumbling together of these things, right? Like something,
Yeah.
a being that has the experience, ability to experience feelings and reason and be self-aware, like all
I
together.
don't think
Yeah,
it's idiosyncratic. I think the thing you're
yeah.
talking about is smack dab at the middle of how science fiction uses the word sentience. I think
Hmm.
that you are using the word sentience the way every science fiction book that I grew up with used it. And
Yeah.
I think it's an intellectually incoherent legacy that we have
Yeah.
and I think there's a sleight of hand there. If you
Hmm.
really think about it rigorously, it falls apart. And the sleight of hand is that the
Yeah.
part that's the like usness is
Hmm.
conflated and partly hidden with the part that's like as sophisticated or complicated as us. Do you know what I mean? There's part of it that's like
Yeah.
it can do the thing that we do, which is the important thing. And there's another part that's just like we would recognize it because it's from because it reminds us of us. And those are logically completely separate, but in fact, in terms of how the definition operates, totally conflated. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know. Anyway, so I think it's useful to talk about I kind of want to demystify these terms. I kind of want to talk about like I'm not sure I I I don't I don't think there's a wholly special thing that makes humans human that's not accessible to other creatures. I
Hmm.
think that sentience, if we want to mean by that like feeling emotions and reacting to your environment, that's something that we share with dogs, right?
Hmm.
And if you want to talk about specifically consciousness, which I still think is a weird term, but if by consciousness you mean, if by rigorously by consciousness you mean having a sophisticated mental model and internal self narrative in which you reflect on your own actions as an external. So you'd be like, I am the sort of person who does this sort of thing. I think that's a real thing that humans do. It has some evolutionary importance. I
Hmm.
don't think it's the summit of creation. I think it's like a weird trick that we do that's like a mnemonic shortcut for dealing with highly social relations. Like it's essentially a tool we use for simplifying predicting social behavior. Like I think that's what consciousness is for, evolutionarily speaking.
Sure.
And I don't think it's like the magic holy. What I do think is the
Yeah.
thing, then there's another thing that is similar to consciousness and may not be real, but maybe it's the only thing that's real. And I cannot talk about it without sounding mystical. But I think if you're going to sound mystical, you might as well actually be mystical about it. And
Hmm.
that is the fact that I experience anything, like the fact that the only thing that ever happened, as far as I know, is that I, whatever I am, had a series of sense impressions. I don't actually know that you exist. I'm just looking at a
Hmm.
screen depicting you. Maybe it's all right. Like so, this is very quickly like, am I in the Matrix land, right? Which is sort of sophomore philosophically. But what's real is that like there's some core experience that I talk about and you don't know if I actually have it or not. I might be a philosophical zombie just saying these words. ChatGPT would say
Hmm.
the same thing if you asked it. But I
Right.
know, and you don't know that I know, but I do, that I have the experience of like being a self in the world. But
Hmm.
about that, I do not agree with Descartes and the Western tradition. I essentially believe the Upanishads, right? I believe in the Eastern tradition about that, which is that this self, this experience of the world, this selfness, this being, has nothing to do with my mind and my body. Like my beliefs, the fact that I don't want to kick puppies and do want to save drowning people, or that I like am passionate about whatever, all of that is just this worldly, and the thing that's looking out through my eyes, you could take it and put it in any other person or any rock or any star. It's like if there's a self, it's like there might be more than one, or there might be only one. Maybe we're all the same self playing at being people. But I guess what I'm saying is I never bought this. I was a little alienated by the Western idea of the afterlife, where it's like, Ben, and then I'll die and I'll be in heaven as Ben. And I'm like, what the hell? Like, Ben is clearly a physical phenomenon of this body and this world. Like, Ben is an emergent phenomenon of this. And if there's an I, which is beyond that, then it's not going to wake up in heaven. It always was and always is. And when this body dies, it'll keep on being all the stars and rocks that it's already being, right? So that's like that. Like, I buy that. That's where I would put in the sacred, holy, like the self. I don't think it has anything to do with the trick of consciousness. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it maybe conditions how we experience what we experience, and it's interesting. But like the self thing, the mystical thing is, if you look at a completely materialistic model of the universe, there's no need for it. So it's possibly completely an illusion and it doesn't exist at all. Or maybe it's the only thing because the world is an illusion. Those are essentially isomorphic. Anyway, I think I'm babbling at this point.
You're not babbling. No, I think I get it. But go ahead and restate.
What I'm trying to say is, I think demystifying the stuff humans do with their brains and just being like, oh, you're a social animal that like has a model of yourself in reaction to others. Cool. That's a good thing you do. Just like octopuses like have a brain in each tentacle and they know how to go up a wall. You know what I mean? Like, that's cool. That's a cool trick that this animal does. Do you know what I mean? And if we look at it in terms of all the things that the Descartesian tradition sacralizes as like the reality of the world, if we move this sort of fundamental reality to like the Atman and like the ultimate self, whatever, if we take that out of the picture, all the kinds of cognition, including the ones that Descartes thinks are special, are just like cool tricks animals do with their brains, right? And so the question of like, could we build a brain that does that is an interesting one, but it isn't. I think that's separate from the mystical thing.
So that's interesting. I mean, I think we may just fundamentally disagree, which is fine, right? Like, the mystical thing you reference sounds lovely to me,
Sure.
but not anything I have any belief in, right? And so it reminds me a little bit of Diane Duane's The Wounded Sky, right? Which is a Star Trek novel where which actually they sort of did a version of it very recently in Discovery as well. But the basic idea is we break through to another universe. It's kind of a proto-universe, and we wake up accidentally.
Yes, we've told this before, right? But yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
there is a point in the show notes to the last time we talked about this.
Yeah, but I think it's
yeah, we wake up God.
So
it's a cool idea.
Hang on, I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
So anyway, the God wakes up, the God comes to self-awareness, which it had no need for before. Once there is an other, it then realizes that it is not the other. It is then frightened, and then there is a kind of a process of where it lashes out and then learns how the crew of the Enterprise kind of offers it the option of like, you can just destroy us, you're immensely powerful. Are you going to, but it's your choice, right? Like, whether to do that or not, and whether to care in some sense, right? And so and I guess that's the and I think what we talked about once before too is the way in which, like, the story I tell my kids when they were little and were scared about death is essentially a version of that. This idea that there might be a vast sentient soul to the universe, essentially, right? Similar to me, that sounds like what you're talking about. And maybe
you might be it.
And pieces of it may break off and, kind of like go through an experience of living a human life without being aware of its connection to the larger whole. And then maybe when you die, you get to rejoin the whole and bring back all of those experiences to enrich the whole, etc. Right? That's essentially what Duane sort of offers the proto-god as a model for what it can do when they leave, and so it's not left all alone.
You're right. Right.
So I love that as a concept. If there's like a version of heaven, like that would probably be my version of heaven. But I don't really believe in it, right? Like I'm a gardener. I believe in the beauty and ephemerality of the snowdrop, right? Like it comes, it's
Yeah.
gorgeous, it's unique, and then it dies and it's gone. And I think that is generally my feeling about human consciousness. I do feel like
Sure.
there is something distinct, and so maybe you don't, but I think there's something distinct about sort of, and not necessarily better, worse. I mean, you talk about sacralization, right? Like but the combination of, you know, being able to soothe the child, right? Many animals, maybe all animals, do some version of that, right?
Well, just ones that have high investment parenting. I mean, I don't think fish that just drop eggs and leave don't suit.
Right. So, but many,
it's a common
animals,
trait, certainly among mammals.
Right? Certainly, yeah. So
it's
common
kind
traits,
of it kind of says it on the tin with mammals, right?
And there's a whole bunch of, and also like beyond your own offspring, caring for the tribe, caring for the stranger. You've actually, that's been certainly documented in animals. And so that, to me, feels important. Like this is something, I guess that's a piece that I don't see AI having yet, it can simulate, like we can teach it to
that goes to part two. Like I think to some extent, I think what's interesting about AI is that there's both some there and not the there that people think there is there. And so let's talk about the mathy boxes in a minute.
Right. So I guess that's one piece is the caring versus simulating caring, etc. And then the other is the self-awareness piece. And maybe the self-awareness piece is not so super important, but it feels distinct.
Well, I don't know. Neither of those things, like let's not worry about like how large language models work until we get to part two. But like if we're doing the thought experiment, right? If we stay in the realm of traditional science fiction like thought experiment, I don't see why either of those behave frankly, I don't think you can. I think you probably can't build a complex functioning social creature without giving it emotions. There's a great line in Ancillary Justice
emotions I think are not the same as self-awareness, but go on.
No, I was talking about the first one. I was saying with the soothing the child thing. I was saying well, obviously, I mean, the other thing is that, I mean, soothing a child, well, you said caring. You said the distinction between simulating and caring, right? So like, I mean, teddy bears soothe children, and they're not particularly combinatorically or they don't do a lot of calculation. They just are teddy bears. They're very good at soothing children. And so if you're talking about external behavior, like it's not too hard to build something that would be soothing, I expect. It's probably hard, but it's not there's nothing like whether it actually cares is like that's kind of like to some extent it's so first of all, at a reductio ad absurdum, it's unknowable. I don't know if anybody cares. I don't know if anybody else is. They could all be philosophical zombies. Maybe they're all just. Maybe everybody around me is just built to do the thing. That's a silly notion because in fact, for all practical purposes, they care. I have two reasons for believing that people care. One is they sure seem like they do, and the other is that structurally they're similar to me, and I care. So I guess I assume that they're like me and they do what I do, right? Which in most cases is true, right? Like, but the on some level, like, first of all, I'm not sure that the internal state of cognition matters that much in some sense. Like, if it's unknowable, if the mask never slips, then do you know what I mean? Like if it turned out that there was a little person inside steering the thing. Anyway, whatever.
It matters to me, right? So it may not.
And it matters. So the other thing I was going to say is that I don't see why it would be hard. Do you know what I mean? Like let's put it this way: caring has evolved separately in. Well, I don't know if this is 100% true, but it certainly seems like Well, I'm wondering about cladistically. Like, I think that, like, let's say, I'm not sure, but the common ancestors of mammals and birds, it's pretty far back. Maybe
Mhm.
they cared for their young. I don't know. Are there invertebrates that can, like two octopuses and stuff care for I'm curious now. Now I'm wondering, is there a single like evolutionary line of like, but I don't think there is. I think probably it's pretty um there are lots of evolutionary tracks that would get you there, right?
Mhm.
And I don't have any difficulty believing that like birds and dogs and
Mhm.
everybody actually care. There used to be a school in the mid 20th century that animals, that it was sort of like anthropomorphizing animals and attributing to them human emotions was like bad science because you were like, kind of sentimentally projecting emotions onto them,
Mhm.
whereas emotions are a thing only humans have. That has, first of all, just fallen apart gradually for lots of reasons. Like literally once you can scan their brains and you go like, this is this area and this is when it
Right.
evolved and it's lighting up in humans and dogs at the same time when they're in the same social
Sure.
situation for the same evolutionary reasons. Like you have to go out on a large, you're sort of god of the gapsing at this point if you claim that somehow humans are having emotions and animals aren't, right? Because
Right.
you have to explain so many coincidences. But but um but like uh yeah, so on that sense, in the sort of a broad idea sense, I don't know. I don't see it just seems like it's a very complex behavior. And the same thing is true although, for self-knowledge or self-awareness or whatever it is. Like I think I feel like there's a reasonably solid hypothesis of why that would evolve. You know what I mean? Like I
Mhm.
think that and I'm not talking about the mystical thing of like
Mhm.
wow, I'm having this experience of being me, which I think I might be having if I were a rock, like that's seen in
Mhm.
Everything Everywhere All at Once. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, I don't know, like, right? When we're not talking about that ensoulledness, we're just talking about the fact that I am in my mind, in my physical human brain, have like a network of electrical things that goes like, oh, Ben. Oh, do you know one of my favorite stories that I'm sure I've mentioned before is Daryl Gregory's second person present tense. You know that story?
Have read that story, but a long time ago.
Well, it's a terrific story, and it's essentially
Yeah.
posits this situation in which consciousness is disrupted, right? Like this person ends up becoming effectively a different person, even though they're in the same body and everything, because there was a lacunae in their consciousness.
Mhm.
And I found that really compelling. And the model they talk about some like there's some cognitive research in there is dropped where consciousness is essentially this internal self-narrative. Essentially that, that the
Mhm.
queen thinks she's in charge and parliament is making these decisions and sending to the queen and then the queen is announcing them and she thinks she made them. And what happens in the case of this person is the person who delivers the message
Mhm.
gets disrupted or whatever. So they never arrive with the message. But like that, I think that consciousness is a compressed narrative of our actions that we observe ourselves to have taken that we then use as a feedback mechanism to essentially condition and control our um, space of our constrain our decision making space because we know we have a script of like who we are and we can compare new decisions and winnow some of the possibilities away by quickly checking them against what I would do. And the other thing the way it arises is also that if you have a complex social group of primates and you care which ones are pissed off at you, you have to pay attention to their behaviors. And then if they're not literally in your line of sight, it's evolutionarily advantageous to be able to predict their behaviors and be like, I took this guy's last fig. He's probably going to be mad at me. Then that means I have a mental model of like him being mad at me. And then as an elaboration on that, it's useful if I have a model of what he thinks I would do, like, would he think that I ate the fig? Am I the kind of guy who would eat the fig? Or was he going to blame someone else because that person more likely to eat the fig? So at that point, you have a model not only of him, but of him modeling you. You're modeling him, modeling you. And like at some point, like so consciousness is do you know what I mean? Like nothing about it seems super hard. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy on the level that we can do it in 2024, but if we're doing a thought experimenty thing where you can
Yeah,
like,
I have no idea. I think I have no idea whether it's hard or not. I don't know whether I just have not seen anything that convinces me that we're there yet. Right.
oh well,
And
no,
so,
that's part two of the discussion. We're definitely not there
right.
yet. We're
So
not.
yeah. So
Nobody is. I mean,
that's all
yeah.
I'm saying. Like that to me, like the caring piece of it, animals do. Lots of animals do. The self-aware piece of it, some animals may do, and I don't, I just don't know enough to know for certain. But I don't see any signs that show me tech being close to that. I see tech
Well, let's go to
simulating.
tech in a
So
minute,
yeah. I did want to, when you were mentioning Daryl Gregory, second person present tense, it was reminding me, I wanted to throw out another book, a book title, Matt Ruff Set This House in Order, which
I love that book. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is very much exploring similar things, and I strongly recommend it. So, but anyway, go on.
So, I mean, yeah. So let's bridge our way to like where we are now. I mean, I guess what I'm just saying, so I think we agree, like there isn't anything fundamentally about, you said something about conscious skepticism about conscious that we build ourselves, but you don't mean in principle, you mean as of 2024, as of current state of the art. Well, fine. So I mean, now.
Yeah. Well, okay.
The last thing I want to say about
actually, hang on. I'll clarify. And this again is coming out of my ignorance, right? I guess even in the future, like, I don't know, like I don't know how hard a problem it is, and so there's, I guess, a piece of me that like wonders whether, do you know how people used to be like, well, if you built a big enough computer, eventually there would just be so many connections, it would come alive, right? You know, so not quite that. But there is a sort of question in my head about like, well, there are all these people who are working on creating AI, following various approaches that, you know, doing the research, et cetera, so on. And wouldn't it be kind of great if it happened elsewhere out of some synergistic set of connections, out of things that we're doing with tech, et cetera. That's kind of what I mean.
I see what you mean.
And I don't know how likely that is. Maybe it's impossible.
Well, and that is partly a segue. And I do want to say two things about that. One is, because I think, so one thing is, it is true that in the history of AI, we, particularly because, as I said, in this Cartesian tradition, we originally, they started out with a research program privileging certain kinds of consciousness. They were like, well, if I can play chess, then that's smart. Smart people play chess. And very often it's like easy problems are hard problems are easy, right? Like soothing a child it's actually pretty easy to build something to play chess, relatively speaking. Build something to soothe the child much harder. Like, but you know, women and servants do that. So you know what I mean? Like there was a certain like centrality of like the important kinds of thinking are what you learn at Harvard, where actually those are not particularly demanding kind of cognition. Actually, the reason it's demanding for humans is that we're wired in this messy way where like it's actually really hard for us to think like logically and like methodically. The reason it's hard for us to think that way is that's not, generally speaking, a very useful kind of way for a person like us to think. The context in which things like deductive logic and like careful, rigorous reasoning are useful are basically when you have a situation where you've abstracted out a lot of individual things that you can measure very accurately so that they are all comparable, and you have lots of time to think about it, which is like not a very big slice of the existence of a primate on planet Earth. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not like sometimes we think like, well, you know, like that's not how we mostly do stuff. Whereas the von Neumann machine computers that we built were built from day one. So it's actually really easy to do, for them to do that stuff. And it is manifestly clear that stuff is not that useful, right? Like the stuff that we valorized in the 1950s as like the apex of thinking is like a trick that's hard for us to do, is not super useful in general. It has some uses, you know, we got science out of it, but like it's not that useful. And it doesn't get us. We didn't get science out of it, actually. We got the last step. We got some mechanisms that are important for science. The regulatory mechanism of making sure you don't make mistakes or you notice that you make mistakes, but you don't actually get science out of it because science actually requires all this creativity and intuition that is not part of that at all. Anyway, so it's wrong to say we got science out of it. Anyway, but it's helpful. There's some helpful things about like discursive, formal, rigorous logic, but it's not that big slice of the pie. And therefore, what's happened with AI as time has gone on, that as we've tackled harder problems than playing chess, like playing Go, we ended up using, there's an interesting paradox where the more sophisticated problems we tackle, we have breakthroughs where we can solve these problems. But every time we do, we less understand what we're doing. So if you go back and read sort of post-cyberpunk kind of like, transcendent cosmic post-human fiction of like the late 90s, early 2000s, like I'm a huge fan of Greg Egan, right? And like in Diaspora, they have these minds that, are being created and those like these sentient AIs who are the main characters of the book. And it's a wonderful description and very powerful, but there is this sort of 20th century vibe where it's like, well, because they are computers, they truly understand themselves. Like they can kind of optimize. They could be like, I'll be like this, right? Like we'll remove all the things that are like that or whatever. And like, in fact, what's interesting is that the once we tackle really sophisticated hard problems, the kind of computation that's happening has become so complex that we don't know what they're doing. You know what I mean? We don't. It's no longer the if-then flowchart that's like, well, I programmed it, so I can predict. No, they have no clue, and it's hilarious. Looking to segue a little into part two, to look at the way that with large language models, the way that they're trying to rein them in. It's hilarious. For one thing, the fact that previously computer science papers were like, this is the algorithm. It works like this, and therefore we can study it and we analytically and we can see that it has these properties. You used to write about computer programs like they were math. And now we write about computer programs using the techniques of experimental psychology. Like if they're writing about what language, I've seen a lot of papers with large language models, and what they say is, well, because we don't actually know what we're doing, but we figured out that this region lights up when we give it this input, which is exactly what you do. It's like they're basically PET scanning the thing and going like, when it's playing checkers, we realize that this region, we've identified that we don't quite understand why, but we know this region, and we kind of believe that this is where it stores the board. They're talking about it as the way we talk about the human brain, which is kind of hilarious if you've been around since the 20th century, because we used to think that we would get to the point where AI would allow us to truly like research and understand, and then we would know how the brain works. And we're in the opposite position, where we now can do things that previously only the brain can do, and we don't understand them any better than we did when, it's just as obscure as when wetware was doing it, because of the way it works, right? There's this massive, enormous amount of data. Nobody expected that the way AI would work would be, and this isn't AI, but the thing that we have now, nobody expected it to solve these problems, because we just had a radical breakthrough in what kind of problems we can solve. And nobody really thought back in the 20th century that it would be a very short program and an enormous body of data, and then like this complicated statistical trace that is basically like, just like, I don't know what's in there. So that speaks to what you're saying about like maybe we'll get to it from some other way. I think in two ways. One is we don't know what we're doing. So it's not, if you're if when you say I'm skeptical of AI that we create, you mean that we create by means of like reasoning out how it should work and then doing that, you are 100% right to be skeptical, because that has not worked. All of our victories have been by giving up on the idea that we will be able to tell it how it works. Be able to, the idea that we'll be able to say, in this condition, you should do this. And also the way that the companies are trying to like rein in, you can prompt hack ChatGPT. You can like, under some circumstances, you can trick it into telling you the instructions that they gave it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And the instructions that they gave it are basically like just pleading with it to do things. Like, they don't actually understand it. So they're just like, under no circumstances sound like a Nazi. Like that's just basically, it's like a genie. It's like they just plead with it not to do things and like try to get it to do things. And you can totally trick it into doing the things they don't want it to do, because they don't understand how it works. Like that is a beautiful thing. So that, in that sense, the sort of like random emergent weirdness, we're already pretty deep into. The train has already left the station. We are already not in a land where AI or whatever is like, I built this thing, and because I am the author of it, I know how it works. No, we're far past that, right? But the other thing that I want to say that's sort of counterbalancing to that, to the issue of like, will we get there some other way? And we might, but I think there's a way in which this kind of great chain of being thinking, right? Where it's just like, it began with slime mold and then it evolved to us. We are the apex of creation. Where there's a sort of like this notion that there's some sort of teleological destiny that leads toward the vaulted heights of human consciousness. I think it's a useful corrective to be like, wow, there's a hugely vast ecosystem that's super complex and has all these really interesting corners. And like over here in this little cul-de-sac, there's these weird little creatures that are so into like being social that they not only predict each other's behavior, they predict their own behavior. And over here, there are sea slugs that can like fertilize themselves. And over here, there's like this kind of creature that like lives forever. And literally, there's jellyfish that literally like just reset themselves whenever they get old to babies. Like, and all of those things are like equally badass weird corners of evolution, but like the idea that if you just have a complicated enough machine or you just do a complicated enough thing with it, it'll just like head toward human consciousness is like doesn't seem to be any more fundamentally likely than it would head toward simulating any of the other really weird corners of the natural world, right? Like maybe what will spontaneously emerge is like the jellyfish thing where they like turn back into babies after they're old. Like that would be a cool thing for a computer to figure out how to do. And it's just as likely to figure out how to do that as it is to figure out how to help self-consciousness. Do you know what I mean? You know what I mean? And usually it's about evolutionary pressure. It's like, well, that emerged in this context because there was a reason for that to be the thing that became more common. So you would expect self-awareness. And if self-awareness doesn't arise through us making it, rigging it up, then I am not sure if we would recognize it. Do you know what I mean? Like again, like how would we know, and what would, why should it be anything like ours? Why should they be I guess that's my fundamental question on some level about the thought experiment is, but why would they be anything like us? There's so many things to be.
They might not be. They might not be. And this is, again, like, and I think we should wrap this and take a break and come back and talk about the real world
stuff. Part 2. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but
that sounds good.
I think this is, essential. I don't know that it's likely. It is still the dream. It is the dream of not being alone in the universe, right? And like having some other sentience that we recognize, that we can talk to, that we can, that we can engage with in a way that makes sense to us.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is it's two dreams. I think it's two dreams. And it's two dreams and a literary context. Like, so part of our dreams are inherited from the fact that if you want to write a book, which is a novel, has a certain structure. It has characters. The characters often communicate with one another. It's kind of hard to write a novel where they don't. So, they need to be made comprehensible to the reader. So because of these constraints of the form, as opposed to if you're doing an interpretive dance piece where you have different constraints, like we end up with narratives about aliens that make them very us-like because that's what works as characters in a book. But I think there are two dreams, and they're very close to my heart. Like one of the things it's easiest for me to cry about if I sit down and I'm like, let me, unburden myself and spend time with someone listening to me, and I'm going to try to like have a deep catharsis about my emotions. One of the things that's like the easiest for me to access is like the possibility that there's life on other planets. Like I can just cry like a baby about like my hope that there's life on other planets. But and partly I think that goes back to like Cold War terror and being like, I hope this isn't our only shot. I hope this isn't our only shot. And if we fuck up here, there's somewhere else that we can't fuck up. That's too far away. I actually don't want to get there and visit. I want there to be life on another planet that we will never get to, so we can't fuck it up, right? And that does have to do with some kind of identification. That does have to do because I'm calling me and this thing on the other planet us. So I feel some kind of kinship to it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I need to be able to talk to it. I don't know that my talking to it even needs to be a soluble problem or something it would even understand as a thing. You know what I mean?
I agree. And I think I have a similar response to, I have that response. And this goes back to like what I was saying to my daughter about, AI being our children. Like, I mean, this is going to sound very morbid, but I'm like, even if they'll go crazy and, kill us all, right?
At least they'll be around.
At least they'll be around, right? Like, this is very somehow comforting to me.
Yes, I mean, that would be comforting. Sadly, of course, are the entire direction of our technological civilization. The idea that we're going to create conscious machines seems like, well, maybe not this decade, but it's interesting. The idea that we're going to create any technological contraption that would live past 10 years Like that's a whole there you got to go back and retool everything we've done since 1800. Like that, you know what I mean? Like that's like, no, they're going to live another 5 minutes after they destroy us because the batteries will run out and nobody will have taught them to change their own batteries because everything we build requires a global supply chain and like the ability to sell you more things in 6 months. Anyway, not to rain on your parade. Let's take a break.
We need the no. We need the equivalent. We need the equivalent of seed banks for tech, right? You know, like someone's got to be working on that.
Yeah, I don't know. Like to some extent, if we want things to, I don't know. I think we are the seed banks. Like I think that we need. I think we need tech that we can survive without like a 5% growth a year impossible fantasy. Like we need sustainable tech, and by that I don't just mean like green label slapped on. I mean always coming home, Le Guinian, like somehow a whole different way that we design things from the get-go. We can link to the Long Now Foundation in the show notes.
And I wanted to throw in, I just taught yesterday or Friday, I guess. My students did not love this, but from the Big Book of Classic Fantasy, edited by the Vandermeers, a story called Dance of the Comets, an astral pantomime in 2 acts by Paul Scherbart, which was originally intended to be a ballet. And so it is a narration of a ballet, and it kind of doesn't really work. As the students pointed out, but it is interesting.
What is the quote? Dancing about writing about music is like dancing about architecture.
Yeah. So it's
like dancing about comets.
If you're interested in this question of like other ways of representing the world without necessarily, although he does have characters in the ballet, but without characterization in the same way, etc. You might take a look at that piece. All right, we're gonna break and come back. Talk about the real world.
Sounds good.
Do you want to launch in? We were talking about where we are.
Well, maybe we should have Darius tell us about the thing that he stumbled upon as an intro, and then we can kind of talk about.
Yeah,
Darius, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So there's this thing blowing up on TikTok where I'm at a lot of the time called Sora. It's this new video AI video creation has been around, but it has not been very sophisticated. Like you could tell, it looks pretty janky. But the new program Sora is coming out where it's creating like very realistic, almost photorealistic videos, and it's kind of getting people in a little bit of an uproar because they can imagine scenarios in which deepfakes are already a thing, right? So in conjunction, like deepfakes and now Sora, people are getting a bit scared about like the kinds of things that might come out because of this, in terms of socially, legally.
It's interesting. Sorry.
Go on. Yeah.
Sorry, we're getting a little choppiness. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I think what I was gonna say was just that I try generally pretty hard not to share AI generated images, and just this morning I posted on Facebook, like what I thought was a door by Gaudi, that Gaudi does these beautiful florally kind of doors.
Was it the one that was on a corner and it was this very like weird bulbous house that was very colorful? Is that what we're talking about?
It was very colorful, but his stuff is very colorful.
Oh, it looked kind of like a Gaudi.
It might have been.
It looked kind of like a Gaudi. Well, I saw that somebody did this takedown.
Like I was willing to buy, and so someone just posted on my Facebook wall and said like that one's not real. Just so annoying. I deleted it and I was like, dang it! But it fooled me. It fooled me. I didn't really stop to think about it, and
we have a little lag. I saw a Gaudi corner house thing and it looked very realistic and I was like, oh yeah. And then somebody posted like this incredible 17-point description of like, that sidewalk is way too wide and there are no and there are no like signposts or scratch. Everything is perfectly like smooth, and and like those windows would be at ankle level, and like they would, the windows are basically letting in light from the people's ankles until their stomachs, like like it was just like 17 things that were like, well, it was like, it's like a what's wrong with this picture thing, which is all of these things that like, yeah, that like that anyway, I thought that was very funny, both that I had totally not seen any of those things before reading the list, and also that on some level it's like, clearly there's a craft there of like figuring out what, you know what I mean? Like, for somebody who's attuned to it.
Although now, so I haven't seen that particular takedown. I kind of want to argue with it a little bit. Like, I get sometimes frustrated by the takedowns, right? Because they're often wrong about specifics. Like, I've seen ones that say things like, well, you would never, like, there's nowhere for this stove to vent. And in fact, I've seen in the real world that kind of ventless design, right? It's a high-end design. It's like whatever. And like the window thing, like, I live in an old Victorian. The first floor windows are not quite to my ankles, but like below my knees. They are low, right? And in Charleston, I want to say, I think it's Charleston, there are these houses that have windows that go all the way to the ground, right?
And I think it was less how far down they went as how far up. Like, if you stood and looked, you wouldn't see out the window,
Yeah, maybe, but I mean, it's just one of those, like,
and also just a lot of stuff about like, and also it wasn't symmetrical. They're like, Gaudi, there's good reasons why architecture is symmetrical, and Gaudi's stuff is all symmetrical, and this is not. Like, anyway, it was just the kind of thing where it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying, of course, there is a danger of like, because people have a knee-jerk cynicism, there's a danger of them over, determining whatever, adding things like that.
Hypercorrecting.
But I guess what I'm saying is, I think it's interesting. There's no particular, none of the things on the list was a thing where you'd be like, well, no, but an AI would definitely not miss that. It's like, no, that doesn't make it. Presumably none of that was factored into its request. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know. So it's kind of interesting, the notion that that there are tells, and that's going to be a whole cottage industry, right? Like the whole like how, like, it's another evolutionary arms race where people getting attuned to like, what about this looks AI like?
Yeah, there's actually a recent example of a book that came out, and it was kind of popular on TikTok. I think the author was Nix or something. And it was getting a lot of flack on TikTok because people were starting to identify some weird elements in the cover art. Like, because the cover art was like of a like a kind of like Gothic fence with like a Gothic mansion in the background, and people were identifying that the fence didn't quite meet up in some places, or like certain parts of it like were not connected to the actual frame. And like the house in the background was weird. Like windows in weird places. So I think it's interesting how these pictures, now videos coming out where people are arguing about its authenticity. I mean, it's only going to get better from here, but
I mean, it's going to get better, but there are also, I imagine I mean, like right now for the visual stuff, I think it is mostly what I've seen is people IDing these elements, right? And, starting with the, early stuff where Midjourney was putting out things with like 6 fingers on a hand or whatever it is, right? But at least in the text world, right, with ChatGPT, we now have ChatGPT detectors that my colleagues are using on
which is also fraught, because they will also get lots of false positives, and
they do get lots of false positives. But I guess, like, that's one of those things where clearly there's going to be a need for us to be able to tell the fakes from the real thing. People are working on the fixes for that. I guess you could be really fatalistic and be like, well, there's going to be deep fakes that are so good that nobody will be able to tell. Which is politically very scary, right? In terms of like, I wonder whether, hang on, let me finish. And kind of concurrent with that, I think there's a growing skepticism, right? Like, I do usually, like, I feel dumb that I missed this Gaudi fake. I don't think I usually do share that kind of thing. And I think that's becoming, I don't know, like a cultural norm and a, sort of a social Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're a good citizen, you're not going to be sharing AI images without telling people those are
That is
AI
also really
images.
interesting. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it's fun. If you label it as AI, that's one thing, but if you don't tell people, then you're
Yeah. Yeah.
contributing to that. And I'm curious to see like how the next generations handle that. Like, I feel like you
Mm-hmm.
and I are in our early 50s are kind of, on the cusp. And I suspect
Mm-hmm.
that like people like my dad probably are not going to be so interested in like doing the work to interrogate
So,
those things.
I mean, here's the thing. Like I saw a really interesting article about this, which maybe we can find and put in the show notes. I don't know, in the Atlantic or something about, or maybe the New Yorker, about kind of the history of fakes, right?
Mm.
Going back to like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle hooked by like this famous picture of like fairies. You know what I mean? That was like all the
Mm.
rage in Victorian England when
Yeah.
photography was relatively new, and it was like a pretty obvious to modern sensibility fake where they put some fairies in front, like cut out fairies in front of a thing. But like at the time, people were like, if you really wanted to
Mm.
believe in fairies, like, you know what I mean? It seemed like hard
Yeah.
evidence. Um, and the point of the article was that, in fact, so we're coming out of a brief period in human history, quite brief, where there was the weird situation that um, uh, technology to accurately capture something was so far out ahead of technology to pretend that something was the case that even though it was possible to fake things, and there's a million like the examples of like Soviet doctored pictures and all this stuff, and like,
Mm.
but like that took a lot of effort. And so to a first approximation, most people could generally feel like a picture of something proved that it had happened, which is something that
Mm.
had never before happened in human history.
Right.
And I think there's an XKCD comic about this. There's a brief window of 50 years where, or maybe at the outside 80, 100 years, where like a picture of something proved that, Pixar, it didn't happen, right? That
Mhm.
the era of Pixar, it didn't happen. Whereas we are now returning to the era of even with Pix, it might not have happened. And the fact is that the point the article was making is people are very rarely fooled by deepfakes. They're very rarely fooled by deepfakes, not because deepfakes aren't good, not because they can detect the tells or they look for steganographic
Yeah.
signatures, but because in fact people use all kinds of ways of determining whether to be skeptical of some information. So if you see a perfectly flawless video of Biden admitting that he killed
Yeah.
someone, you are
Right.
not going to believe it unless you already believe A, that
Right.
Biden killed someone, and B, that he would have been on TV. Like the room for doing a deep fake that is plausible enough, so that in a way it's like once the cat out of the bag. Like if you know that deep fakes are even a thing,
Mhm.
I expect people's skepticism to surge ahead of the technology, so that even things
Right.
that couldn't possibly be deep faked, people are unlikely to believe because they're like, that's a fake. And that's what we see now. We see more
So,
true things being accused of being fake than we see fake things convincing people, because people are in fact quite epistemologically conservative, right?
right.
People need not just to see, and there was even this brief period of 80 or 100 years where we could have this cultivated naivete about like, I saw it, so it must be real. Like I saw a picture of it. Like that, even that didn't entirely erode our epistemic conservatism, where in order to believe something improbable, we need a bunch of lines of evidence, right?
Yeah.
We would need for it to be something that we believe could happen in a reputable journal with other people vouching for it. Like we very rarely believe something at first glance just because. So to some extent, there's a moral panic about deepfakes that has recurred at each point. That
So
since the invention of photography, every
let me
time
argue.
people somehow, yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
I'm gonna like point people to the thing and also argue against it a little bit.
Yeah.
So the article is, I believe, what the doomsayers get wrong about deepfakes. It's in the New
Mm-hmm.
Yorker, and
Yeah.
it's a review of this book, A History of Fake Things on the Internet by Walter J. Shirer. Okay.
Okay.
So that's that. If people want to dig into that, that's the thing. I agree mostly, and it's reassuring to think that, but the piece and like where I see evidence for that being, let me take this back a step. So if you look at things like mass shootings in America, which
Mm-hmm.
is a thing, right?
Sure.
And you look
Sure.
at like how they were reported initially and people's responses,
Mm-hmm.
and on the internet, once we started having all of this fast communication, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then there came a moment, and I feel like I could go back through my blog entries and like find the moment where people started putting out the kind of like a checklist of like, you hear something terrible has happened.
Mm-hmm.
This
Mm-hmm.
is what you do.
Right.
Like, first you wait,
here's how to
give it
verify.
time,
Sure.
check sources, et cetera, and so on. And I feel like that has greatly improved from where we were before that point, right?
Yeah.
So that we are less likely to spread panic than we were around these incidents. So, okay. But at the same time, there's still some danger there. And I think that's so whether it's a deepfake video or, we actually just had a soft lockdown incident at the high school last week, where my daughter is a student at the school and I'm a board member. So I was kind of getting it from multiple angles, right? I was getting the text messages from her in the lunchroom saying there's cops here, she's scared. I'm getting the notes from the superintendent being texted to the board about what the actual situation is. And I'm seeing in the online Facebook mom groups, the explosion of what's going on, where's my kid, can I go pick him up, et cetera. And in those crisis moments, a lot of misinformation gets spread very fast, right? And
sure,
I think that's the kind of thing where, it's a little bit of the wag the dog stuff and so on, right? Where, in something major like the American presidential election or something, I worry about something coming out, just before the election, before people have a chance to vet it and to expose it as a fake, that does influence a lot of people who are not necessarily so skeptical. And it's a timeline problem. And I played this game called Machine Learning President. That's an RPG that is about the influence of technology and other things on on elections. And it was terrifying. It was like, honestly, like we got to the end of the game and we all kind of sat around and had this moment of like, like it is sheer luck if we make it through this, right? Like, because like it was so clear that it would be very easy for people in control of the tech with enough money to manipulate the populace into.
I guess here's the thing. I'm making a narrow argument about faking realistic looking video depicting inaccurate events. That is one social phenomenon. There are other social phenomena, such as the fact that people get their news from their social network of friends reposting things, as opposed to Walter Cronkite sitting on TV at 7 o'clock. That's a different social change based on a different set of technological things. Or like being able to micro parse the electorate so that you can predict which people will be made anxious by some false report of people coming over the border, and like specifically email it to them or insert it into their networks or whatever, or play them YouTube ads. Totally different social phenomenon, right? I am not saying I'm optimistic about the epistemic coherence of our Commonwealth. Like, in fact, the fact that, people, talk heads have been talking about this for a long time, right? We've retreated into different information bubbles. Like, I'm very acutely aware of how, like, even just among people even just about like the war, the Gaza war, like I interact with people who are in totally different informational worlds about it, right? And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a scary thing because of the decoherence and the fact that it's eroding the body politic. It also means that there things are reported, like we wouldn't have known about George Floyd in the old world, right? Like the fact that everybody is oppressed. The press is free to those who owns one. Everyone's oppressed. Everything's out there, means the world is full of misinformation, and it's full of also people getting things out that would have been suppressed, right? So there are good and bad sides of this informational free-for-all. What I'm specifically saying about the ability to fake a video, as opposed to all of these other technological changes, is that it's kind of like people are really enamored of people overestimate, in my view, dramatically the effect of realism in the sense of like photorealistic accuracy on people's appreciation of narrative. So there are continually these things where we're like, we could have 3D and smell-o-vision. Like if you, we're gonna make this more, and they always, you know, like we'll be able to, so like you'll be able to do all this, and it's like nobody actually when people go to a movie and you give them smell-o-vision or whatever, like it's a cute gimmick, but nobody is like, now that I'm perceiving with this with 3 senses instead of 2, I believe it much more. That's not how narrative works. And in fact, people are totally predisposed to be rumors, and dirty tricks right before an election have always been super effective.
Right.
But like the difference between Nixon's operatives dropping a dirty trick into the newspaper or, you know, calling a press conference to insinuate something right before versus doing that with a hyper-realistic video when everybody knows those can be faked is marginal. Right? Like essentially, if somebody tells you that in the Pizzagate, the Democrats are running a child slavery ring, you know what I mean? Under Comet Pizzeria in DC, which was what the caused the shooting. If your neighbor tells you that, or if somebody shows you a video of them doing it, it's not a big difference once we know that videos can be faked. Like it's not necessary to do a whole video. You just have to say the Democrats are doing it, and somebody who's inclined to believe that is going to believe it. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying there's not some effect, but I think on some people who might be swayed, who might miss the boat, whatever. But I think it's a relatively marginal effect. I think, honestly, having robocalls that go specifically to people you've demographically identified as lower information voters who've been kind to believe this and just telling them a thing is going to be a lot more cost effective in spreading this false rumor than like cooking up a video. Although now it'll be cheap to do the video, so cost effective. I take back cost effective because you'll be able to just tell whatever this new thing is, just say make a video of this, and it will, and it'll be plausible.
Well, but, and I do think there's a I agree with you that, you know, hearing a rumor from a friend versus a video that you might be suspicious of, but the one problem is that the videos or the photos are more likely to be viral. I think.
Well, that's what the article says. What the article says is what has been effective is not videos that are pretending to depict an accurate event. And claiming to fool you, because people are very skeptical of those. What is actually very effective is videos that are clearly parody or clearly over-the-top hyperbole, but are sticky and people can share them. And so like a video that tries to make you think that Biden is actually on TV saying he murdered somebody, nobody's going to believe. A video in which is clearly a comical parody in which makes fun of, that is very effective. Nobody need, you know, it's not, it's like, it's the stickiness and the excitement and the way it makes your lizard brain go, yeah, fucking, you know, libtards. That's what's effective about it. The fact that you actually convince someone that something happened that didn't happen, again, not that it will never, and there is a lag time. I mean, people believe famously people believe the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, but only once. That didn't happen like year after year. It's like once people were like, oh, sometimes you hear things on the radio and they're fictionalized. You know what I mean? Like radio was a relatively new medium, so people were fooled for a while. So there probably will be a gap where people who are not will be like, oh my God, it's real. But then they'll feel like, but it's a pretty strong motivation. The thing you experience about posting something and feeling foolish about it, it's a pretty strong motivation for people. Anyway, so I don't think that's the scary part, but I think we should get back to what's happening with AIs and LLMs.
Okay, let me close this out with one
deep fakes
thing.
Is just one little.
Right, it is, but I'll close it out with one piece, just tying it back to the Israel Palestine issue. You know, I was recently having a conversation with a Jewish friend, and he was saying some things that to me sounded extremely inaccurate, and he's a very smart person. And I said, you know, where do you get your news? Have you been reading Al Jazeera? And he was, no. And I was like, how do you decide what's reputable? And I said, well, there is this, you know, media bias chart out there, and he had not heard of it. So I pointed him to this is the adfontesmedia.com interactive media bias chart. And, you know, it ranks things from, you know, extreme left, hyperpartisan left, strong left, skews left, middle or balanced bias. So there's skews right, strong right, hyperpartisan right. So it does that axis. And then it does the axis of contains from the bottom misleading info, selective or incomplete story, unfair persuasion, opinion or wide variation in reliability, analysis or wide variation or reliability, mix of facts reporting and analysis, and thorough fact reporting or fact-dense analysis at the top. And they are nonpartisan, and they are just just checking on these axes. And then from there, you can see that, like, you know, if you want the most centrist thing that has thorough fact reporting, it's going to be the Wall Street Journal, right? If you want it to be
yeah, but I mean,
but if you
right,
want
but I mean,
hang on, but if you want it to be slightly more left, the CBS Evening News, slightly more right, but at least that kind of education in media bias is something that I believe our high school teaches now. And I think when we talk about, you know, kind of inoculating the populace against this kind of thing, part of it is this, like, education in how do you vet sources, which sources are trustworthy, and why. I guess that's what I was trying to get to. And that ties into the, like, my shame thing for not checking my source first before posting this. Like, I could have checked. It would have taken me 5 seconds to just do a quick Google image search and make sure this was actually a Gabby,
like, I
right?
think there's a corrective to that, though.
Yeah.
Because I'm glad that the checklist exists. I think it's useful. I think there is a big difference between an institution like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, which is investing a lot in fact checking, has a reputation to lose, right? And one that, you know, and like somebody's blog and some misinformation that people are sharing and whatever. So that's like, I subscribe to the New York Times partly because I feel like, you know, I like the crosswords, but also because I think it's actually that there is an important, like that kind of, like, sophisticated centrist investigative journalism is dying out, and, you know, or consolidated to only a few places. And I think it's important to support. Like, I'm on board. On the other hand, I am sure, I mean, maybe somebody who knows more about it could convince me otherwise. I am sure that if in the world that I grew up with, people came with eyewitness reporting to the New York Times, but they didn't have cell phones then, that, like, a police officer had killed a black man in broad daylight by you know, stepping on his neck, or the Wall Street Journal, I don't think that story would have run. And I don't think it would have run because I think the people who would be making the decision would be like, well, to believe the people, or Rodney King or whatever, to believe, you have to at least start with an assumption that it's possible that there's a massive systemic climate of institutionalized police violence against black people that happens in broad daylight. And I think that you'd be talking to a group of people in 1985 in the Wall Street Journal who would have just dismissed that as not being particularly worthy of investigation because it was so far-fetched. That's the world that I grew up in.
Yeah.
When Rodney King broke, because somebody had literally videotaped the cops beating people, it was a resounding shockwave where all of these centrist organs that were very careful about their facts and everything would have ruled out such information that was beyond the Overton window of what seemed like a plausible story. And so it was like, now we have video of what we've been telling you for 30 years. Like, the Black Panthers were saying this, but that was like a radical, wide-eyed, you know what I mean? So I guess what I'm saying is, like, I think, I don't know that by picking the highest rated, most careful source, you get out of the responsibility in a way of, like, you know what I mean?
No.
And what I like to do in a way is read the widest possible. Like, I don't enjoy it. Like, I am currently reading both. Like, I read stuff written by people who out and out support Hamas and out and out support Netanyahu, even though that is the opposite of my political opinion in both directions, obviously. But I want to know, because to some extent, the thing that I most believe when I'm reading the news, the thing I find most credible, is when people concede a point. Anything, like, a great example is, like, you know who I believe about Hamas's motives and operations is the hostages returning who were freed in the ceasefire, because I do not see what motive, anything nice they say about Hamas, I do not understand what motive they would have for lying about once they're already on Israeli soil having reporting the papers. And similarly, you know, in the other direction, whatever. Like, so it's interesting. I remember when I was living in Italy, I used to read The Economist and, like, Il Manifesto, the communist paper in Italy, and, like, anything they agreed on about economic policy, I felt was probably true. Like,
I agree. That's a more sophisticated approach. I was mostly suggesting kind of like a first step of vetting your sources as
sure.
And to, like,
and there's Snopes and there's Polyfact,
kind of like just knowing how reliable is this likely to be. asking that question is something that I hope my high school student is being trained to do, right? Like is by her school, right? That's
I just think the corollary to that is like everybody always has a bias. Everybody who makes a chart like that is picking where they think the center is. And that's just, inevitably a judgment call. So, which is fine, but it's like it's sort of important not to, you know what I mean? Like you ultimately have to you kind of can't. I mean, it's useful to have a vetting mechanism, but you kind of are, Anyway, so let's get to the actual AI part of the AI before this part of the episode ends. Because there's some stuff to say about it. So I feel like let me just start by saying, like, let's just start by talking about the what it's actually doing part. Before we get to what's going to happen in the future and like how it's going to affect things and whatever. What I think that like I kind of feel like in one of these positions where I hear like both opinions on both sides that I am skeptical of. It's a little like how I used to feel about the singularity in the old, when that was plot in science fiction, where some people were like, it'll, we'll upload ourselves and live forever within our children's lifetime. And other people were like, yeah, there's nothing there. You can't, like, that's a computer can never think. And it's like, no, neither of those is really. So now we have kind of like a real world practical version of that, where like some people are like, it's alive. It's thinking. It told this Google engineer. It's, you know what I mean? Like this, we've hit it. Like the thing has come alive and it's talking now. And other people are like, it just predicts the next word. In a way that's like, so it's not doing anything. It's just and I don't think either of those is quite right. And I think what's interesting is, I don't think I'm particularly either an enthusiast or a skeptic in the sense that I think that what's happening is there's something from a technologist point of view really fascinating and exciting and unpredictable. And then also people are projecting all of these fears, wishes, and longings onto it when it's, you know what I mean? It's like a technological breakthrough in solving certain kinds of problems, which is really interesting in and of itself. And then, people think that like either it's nothing or like it's the doom of man or it's the Messiah came or like the computers have woken up or whatever. And like, so there's things it's good at and things it's not good at. And there's the sort of idea, which is true to some extent, of like, and it'll just get better from here. It'll get better every year. And it's like, for some things, yes, and for some things, no. I actually found an open source repository, maybe I can find it, of like a whole bunch of people attempting to measure things. And what they do is there's this way in a JSON file, you can basically give ChatGPT or something equivalent, a large language model, a multiple choice test to try to get to solve certain kinds of problems. And then you can automatically grade it. And so they have people come up with all kinds of problems, like, like problems about domain knowledge about the world, problems about logical reasoning, problems about empathy, all kinds of things, whatever, as long as you can formalize it as a test that things can take. And then they upload it and they run all these things through it. And one of the things they measure is as the size of the network grows, as you get more and more and more terms, does it grow linearly? Does it take off exponentially? Or does it like just flatline? It never gets better. And the fact is that there's a bunch of cognitive tests you can give LLMs, and for some of them, they never get better. LLMs just don't solve them. When they get bigger, they still don't solve them. And some of them grow linearly, like as you add more knowledge, they get a little better. And some of them grow exponentially, like you hit a point and it's like, bam, now it's doing a whole different thing spontaneously because you didn't write new code. You just gave it more data and it underwent a phase shift in what it's capable of. And so I think like breaking down all those specific cognition things is really like, anyway, so I'm just saying there's a sort of people want to default to a binary of like either it's nothing or it's like it's a mind, but it's like, well, it is a mind, I guess. It's a complicated system for, do you know what I mean? I mean, I don't know what a mind is. Who knows what a mind is? It's doing something. Thinking is a bunch of skills, and it is getting better at doing some of those skills. Like, I don't think thinking is anything other than some bag of cognitive skills that you could,
So I kind of want to connect this to neurodiversity if we can. And I realize that's like problematic ground, right? So tricky ground, right?
Okay. Sure.
I'm thinking about, the earlier conversation we were having about caring and the way that, society has in the past, sort of acted as if, people with autism perhaps like might be unable to care or define sociopaths as people who cannot care or etc. And I think we are now very suspicious, if not have completely blown up a lot of those assumptions, right? but it does make me, and I have ADHD, and the way my brain works and the things it's good at are different than, than Kevin or, various people who don't have ADHD. And I wonder whether, I don't know, I guess I'm wondering whether this is a fruitful area of analogy for thinking about what the LLMs, like the LLMs are really good at X, and that's great. Like now we've got one that can do that piece of it, just like as someone with ADHD, I'm really good at like being alert to every little thing that comes by, which would have been great when we were, when I was on guard in the village back in the Paleolithic, right? Like would have been super useful. Like, oh, hey, that might be a saber tooth coming at us, right? So, everybody run, right? So,
right.
So I don't know. I don't know. Is that just like, is this me just being
I think there's
overly
a useful,
humanistic, or
Well, I think there's a useful part of that analogy and a dangerous part of it, or a potentially misleading part of the analogy. I mean, the useful part of the analogy is like exploding the notion that there's just smart. Like part of people's confusion around what stage AIs are at is just acting like there's a linear measure of like how smart something or someone is, when in fact there's a bunch of discrete skills, and like tasks that you could do cognition on, and the part that's potentially misleading is, of course, that when people were like, "Oh, autistic people aren't feeling empathy" or whatever, of course, the autistic people were feeling empathy and having trouble maybe communicating or picking up. Like you can't empathize something you can't perceive. You can't empathize with somebody being sad if you can't perceive that they're sad, right? And you might not express it in a way that somebody would understand. And so, like, but the point is, there was actually a human on the other side, and we know what humans are like, right? So, in other words, the human was equipped with all the human things, and then like there were some differences that are confusing. Whereas the AI is really like the piece of the analogy is the AI is like arriving at some of these cognitions in totally different way, like a way that is not, there is no reason to suppose that an AI that's doing this, essentially what we're doing is we're saying the way these things work, you train them, right? So you're essentially, it's very powerful because we're harnessing a technique that in some ways is analogous to evolution. We're saying this is the goal, this is what I want the output to do, you figure it out. And that is the huge quantum leap between quantum leap. I can't believe I said that. That's I hate when people say that. The big jump between the 20th century approach of being like, I will figure out how a thing works, and then I will explain to a computer, like an expert system or a logic tree, like how to do it, versus the big breakthrough of being like, I don't know how you do it, just figure it out. Like I will essentially like make lots of you iteratively, and when you get better at it, I will grow that. This is why it's like evolution. Essentially, if you get better at it, I will grow that, and if not, I will cull. Like I will cull what doesn't work and iterate on what does.
It also reminds me of like the teaching parenting process, right? Because right, like you're trying to teach a kid how to like tie their shoelaces or bake cake or whatever, and yes, you can reduce it down to like, here are like 5 steps or so, right? But in actually teaching 10 kids how to bake cakes, you're probably going to teach them 10 different ways. And you're probably going to like try things, and some things will resonate for some and not for others. And, there'll be bits that are easy for some and not for others, and all of that. So,
and in general, I think the world has moved away from like grand plans and cognitive, like understanding and into iteration, like try it and figure out and do the next thing. Like that's happened in a lot of contexts. So, I mean, so basically, the one thing to remember is that when it can do a thing that we can do, we didn't do that by making it like us. We did it by saying, be what you are and try to do this thing. And the more you do it, the more I will reward you. And then it just happened, right? So it built a statistical map that made it better and better at doing a thing because it was trained on it, right? And it ended up being however it is. And so drawing an analogy from its brain to our brain is like a little bit weird, because that to some extent, this is what we do too with neurons when we learn things. Every brain is also different. Every person's brain is different. But we are using the same, fundamental implementation and substrate. And we've got all this levels of like, we're not just a neural net. We're not just a bunch of like nodes in a graph. It's a cool way of thinking it, and it turns out to be transferable to this other domain, and you can do math on it. But actually, there's a lot more complicated, messy depth going on. Even just dissecting one nerve cell, you'd have whole worlds that is not, like the model would abstract this nerve cell to like a node with some graph going out. But in fact, it's like as complicated as, so it's not us. And it's going to arrive at doing things that in some ways might be interestingly analogous, but in some ways might be completely and utterly different with how we would do it. So it's kind of only as good as what you train it on, right? Whatever you train it to do, it's going to do that. And so one particular category error that people make, I think, is that ChatGPT, there's something that's almost, I want to say, like, I don't want to be too pejorative, but to say this in a kind of evocative way, there's something corrupt, not in a bad way, but there's something where ChatGPT is trained to say what